Welcome to Fair Observer Live, our signature panel discussion that brings together diverse views from around the world. This discussion is hosted by the International Academic Forum at the Osaka School of International Public Policy and Fair Observer. Fair Observer is an independent nonprofit media organization that has published more than 2,500 voices from over 90 countries, including statesmen, retired military officers, former diplomats, and leading professors, along with some of the brightest young public intellectuals from around the world. The IAFOR Research is a politically independent, international, interdisciplinary think tank based at the Osaka School of International Public Policy. Boy, that's a lot. At Japan's Osaka University that conducts and facilitates international interdisciplinary research projects. I am Christopher Roper-Schell, your moderator. I am contributing editor at Fair Observer and partner at Fair Observer Intelligence. With me are my four guests. Professor Haruko San, co-director of the IAFOR Research Centre at the Osaka School of International Public Policy. Atul Singh, founder and CEO and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. And Philip Shetler Jones, Indo-Pacific Fellow at the Council of Geostrategy and former Royal Marine Commando. And lastly, but certainly not least, is Manu Sharma. Like me, he is also a contributing editor at Fair Observer and a partner at Fair Observer Intelligence. How are y'all?
We are very well.
Lovely.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you.
Good. Well, we'll dive right in. How about it? First question is for Philip. Philip, the AUKUS deal ruffled a few feathers. France was not exactly thrilled. Japan felt left out, and India thought the deal smacked of Anglo-Saxon colonial hangover. Do you think the AUKUS deal boosted or weakened security in Asia?
Oh, thank you, Christopher. Thank you for the invitation to this conversation. You listed a couple of countries there, but you missed out one that is relevant, I think, when that's the People's Republic of China. How did China feel about this? And that's not just a question about hurt feelings, I would say. It's about the effect that this deal, AUKUS, has on the balance of power, which is part of what goes to make the region more secure, I would argue. So, of course, we should consider the feelings and reactions of friends and partners, but as a strategic consideration, feelings, perceptions, reactions of opponents should also be borne in mind. France was understandably very unhappy. But then let's think back a few years. 2017, President Macron goes to Garden Island in Australia and talks about a Paris, New Delhi, Canberra axis to bring about a new order in the Indo-Pacific. So how do we think the Americans felt about that at the time? That was under President Donald Trump. Maybe President Macron thought that people's feelings would be excited by a French-led order in the region. So they shouldn't maybe be that surprised by what happened. Perhaps they misjudged the depth and the extent of the transformation of the Trump presidency. I do agree that there's one aspect of AUKUS that makes me slightly uncomfortable, which is this implication and sometimes attribution that it's a kind of Anglo-Saxon club looking backwards in history. I don't think that's helpful. I think that thinking about other partners like Japan in technology cooperation, as the UK is now with joint development of future fighter, is perhaps a corrective to that we might bear in mind. But that example of the French, axis is just only semi-joking, because any grouping can be invidious. It forces those left out to explain why they were not included or invited, and of course there are now many such groups. We've had Five Eyes for a long time and Five Powers defense arrangements, but we've got Quad. I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit more given the meeting they just had. And so I think that this is probably a question that we're going to be talking about a bit more, minilaterals, and whether minilaterals can be divided into helpful and unhelpful. India's feelings, of course, India has had a nuclear propelled submarine program for a long time, and that's expected to come about. And so I don't know whether India would feel badly about it from the point of view of proliferation concerns and so on, because that's something India is also going after. But I think on a positive note, to address the question directly, is it helpful for security? I think it did signal a serious commitment by the US and the UK to a kind of quasi-alliance relationship in the region in a period where, you know, there were questions like the title of this session says about whether the pivot or the tilt are really all that serious. So I think it did transmit that signal. And so far we have the new Australian Prime Minister reinforcing that signal, saying he's fully supportive of AUKUS, despite coming from the other political party, some of whose members didn't have such nice things to say about it. Over to you.
Okay, great. So in there, you talked about regional security. Haruko, quick question now for you. Europe arguably now has a stronger security model than after the Russia-Ukraine war. Finland and Sweden have just launched their bid for NATO membership. What does Asia have, and what does it need to improve security in the continent?
I don't know if it's correct to say that Europe has now a stronger security sort of system. It's always been the case that NATO, as a sort of a collective security system, has always been one of the best models for regional security, because it does have an architecture, whether it's, and Asia has always been, by comparison, seen as sort of weaker. It's been the challenge for a very long time that it doesn't really have a robust security architecture, namely, but this is when we're talking about the Asia Pacific, before things expanded out to the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's a bit misleading to actually sort of say, well, Europe now has it, what does Asia have to do? They have a very different sort of security and strategic concerns, for one. Americans, of course, at the beginning of sort of the Cold War, they did want to build a sort of an Asian NATO kind of an arrangement, but instead it has what is long known as the San Francisco system, or better known as the hub and spokes, where the Americans basically sort of give security guarantees to its allies, and the hubs, namely sort of like the countries like Japan, South Korea, and so on, and some states in Southeast Asia receive American security guarantee, but also sort of stand as the bulwark of the American security sort of concerns in Asia. So the system is slightly different, and of course it has a different historical evolution. So I think that's just a historical sort of fact that I think we probably need to sort of first understand before I sort of say, what does Asia have to do? Never mind whether Finland or Sweden actually gets to join, because Turkey apparently is going to say no. And I think you need a unanimous member agreement for new members to be admitted. So, but that said, for example, I think Philip would know better, but Finland and Sweden joining NATO is a very different thing from, say, what we need to do in Asia in order to calibrate a new kind of a security sort of regime or system that meets the security challenges facing this region. And this is basically about, and of course, China, some of the disputed, and also the legacies actually of the post-World War II settlements. So, and when I said San Francisco system, it really means that the countries that were party to the San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1952. And that means, and a lot of us tend to forget, but Russia, China, and or rather the Soviet Union, China, and the two Koreas are not signatory to San Francisco. So insofar as Japan is concerned, Japan does have disputes as you know, with territorial disputes, both with China as well as with the Koreas, as well as the absence of a peace treaty with Russia. So, what I would think today is that there's a lot of catching up of um, to do in amongst the allied countries, the spoke countries, um, in terms of, in a way, meeting certain security challenges or threats that are seen to be coming from, say, China and also from Russia. But it's the one thing, and these are, of course, to be part of once we start talking about Quad or AUKUS, or how Japan, the US-Japan alliance, is being strengthened and so on and so forth. We can discuss this later. But one of the other thing is that Asia needs to be mindful of is that we cannot draw the similar kind of sort of a binary way of looking at this region in terms of like China or Russia, the authoritarianism versus democracy, and so forth, as might be or easier the case with NATO. So apart from these sort of the military aspects of the security system, I think there's a lot more diplomacy and political issues that need to be navigated not only by the United States but also by the other regional states, that not just the states allied to the United States, but everything sort of is like a chess game. So I don't know if this answers the question, but I think the complexity of
it does. It does. Well, one thing I want to pick up.
Yep, go ahead. Sorry.
Sure, and I want to pick up on that thread. You talked about the history and, to a degree, harmonizing these different regions and systems. Atul, I want to ask you. Pursuant to that, India has abstained repeatedly at the UN in resolutions condemning Russia. Does this make it an unreliable security partner in Asia, or are there other elements?
Well, from India's point of view, everyone has been an unreliable security partner in Asia and outside. So the UK and the US have constantly, as per New Delhi is concerned, been more on Islamabad's side when it comes to Kashmir. And if you were to read the New York Times, you'd think that India was conducting genocide in Kashmir. Ironically, when the genocide that has happened in Kashmir has been of Kashmiri Pandits, the Hindu minority. So I think from an Indian point of view, there is a certain lack of reliability as to security, which is why it is abstaining at the UN. Because look, 60 to 70% of Indian defense equipment is Russian. Should the Chinese have troops, and they do have troops on the border, India will need spare parts. Should the Russians not give spare parts, then India is in trouble. And India is having to do a very delicate balancing act between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Remember, India is sending medicines to the Ukrainians. India is sending humanitarian aid to the Ukrainians because a lot of its engines come from Ukraine. So India is abstaining for security reasons. And in fact, India's abstentions in the UN are neither here nor there. They are a result of domestic economic and political considerations, and they make it a pretty reliable security partner in Asia and elsewhere because it has a large standing army, it has a decent air force, it has a navy that has operational capability, and India doesn't have oil, remember that, which is why the option of cut price oil from Russia is important. The Indian economy cannot take oil at $100+ a barrel for too long. So India has its acute pressure point there, both defense, energy, and of course, geopolitical considerations. But they've got nothing to do with the larger security architecture in Asia. And the elephant in the room really is China. Everyone in Asia is jumping around like cats on a hot tin roof because of the rise of China and Xi Jinping's policy of aggressive defense. So the reality is, which country can really go head to head with China? And as we showed in June 2020, our boys can go hand to hand with the Chinese and come up better. So whether you like it or not, you've got to rely on India for security in Asia.
Okay, that's fair. So the question was whether or not India is potentially an unreliable security partner. Fair enough. So it works both ways, Manu. I was going to ask you this. What is the view from India on the U.S. as a security partner? Will the U.S. back Taiwan against China? Yesterday was an interesting day for a lot of us. I know I read with great interest the reporting there. But can India rely on the U.S. In a conflict against China or Pakistan, or a two-front war with both?
Well, there are multiple parts to this question. So I'll begin with the Taiwanese question and whether US is a reliable security partner or not. The view, in India, in New Delhi, is that US as a security partner is a mixed bag and highly dependent upon the kind of administration or, the bent of the administration in place. For example, from the Indian perspective, the Bush and the Trump administrations were really excellent when it came to security issues. In the post-Soviet era, it's been the case that whenever the Democrats are in power, India somehow, irrespective of, so most people think that maybe it's the Modi effect or the BJP effect, but the fact is that post-Soviet era, whenever the Democrats have been in power, India has had a tough time in Washington, DC. So I can go back to the Clinton era when Clinton famously said that we'll come down like a wall of bricks when, India, not the BRIC one, when India tested the nuclear device. Then Obama used to lean upon the Indian administration to basically ignore constant provocations in the form of terror by Pakistan because of its, Afghan interests. And now you've had the Biden administration, which chose to withdraw from Afghanistan without consulting the only democracy in the region. So there were three takeaways for India, from that withdrawal. The first one was that the US was withdrawing from continental Asia. There are no two views about it. The West and the US, were together withdrawing from continental Asia, and continental Asia is again, so as to say, open for the great game. The second was that the legitimately elected government of Afghanistan, its democratic leaders, they counted for nothing at the end of the day. They were just abandoned. There was a change of regime and nobody cared, or at least they pretended that they don't care. So this whole notion of democracy being a primus inter pares system of governance, it just took a huge knock. And the third was that going forth from what happened in Kabul, the fall of Kabul, hard military power, either in conventional or in sub-conventional domain, was going to be a strong arbiter, if not the only arbiter of disputes. So it was a call to arm up. And the prediction in the sense that I was getting from the establishment was that sooner or later, whatever has happened in Kabul would land at the doorsteps of the West. And it actually came far quicker than anyone imagined in the form of, the Russo-Ukrainian war. So in a nutshell, for India, the current view is, depending upon which, administration is in power, you can depend or not depend on the US.
Right, and we'll return to the point on Afghanistan a bit later. But Haruko-san, I would like to ask you a question. What is the view from Japan on U.S. policy, perhaps specifically to the Russia-Ukraine war? Does Tokyo see the U.S. backing of Ukraine as reassuring commitment to its allies, or does it see this policy as a distraction that weakens the U.S. ability to take on China?
I think the way that Japan, first of all, I could be wrong, But I think Japan saw its role in Ukraine or in support of Ukraine primarily as its obligation towards G7. That was the one group that Japan has always sort of tried to sort of run with, or at least have an engagement, policy engagement with, whether sometimes Japan is the only country that might be representing the Asian voice or whatever. But I think in this occasion, it was definitely something that, of course, it's a dramatic occasion. So, Japan really had to sort of follow suit. The subsequent policy towards Ukraine, whether that had any sort of show to the Japanese reassuring side that, okay, America will come to the rescue, or whether they're a reassuring security partner, I think it's probably a bit unrelated. Because for one, yes, America is sending a lot of money, but it's not as if NATO is actually taking on Russia, right? So it's we are also doing our bit to say take some refugees or support the war efforts from the back end, but that's basically essentially what the United States and some is doing, except they're sending weapons and so on and so forth. So I think this is, I think the Japanese perception of American commitment to Asia actually has been quite strong for the past 10 years anyway, regardless of whether it was Donald Trump or whatever. It's just been, there has been a consistent effort to enhance the alliance, particularly in terms of, reassuring or making sure that the extended deterrence works. So in that sense, Ukraine, it's really been, as I said, whether Ukraine or not, I think Japan's concern has always been more to do with what at the level of US commitment that can actually reassure also the region about how China is behaving. And on that China note, actually, and as I said, the past 10, maybe about 10 years, the alliance has been improving, but it's really in the past 20 years. So we're going back to the Bush administration, but I can also go back to the Clinton administration, but particularly all the way up to Obama, that this is where Asia, as well as Japan, as well as Asia, has had more problems with US-China policy. Never mind Ukraine, never mind Russia. China policy has been the most unreliable because everybody's been sending alarms that, okay, all of these things are happening in the South China Sea, the saber rattling and all of the sort of Blue Navy development, all of these things. We've been warning the Americans, that the Americans, can you do something? But what did the Obama administration do? Pivot to Asia? Where? Right? So, and when America could have called out China much, much more strongly, say 10 years ago, and said, you cannot do this, like say freedom of navigation, if the Obama administration had done it quicker and sooner, I think China would have had different calculations and perhaps a little more cautiousness. Instead of thinking that, okay, we can just do whatever we want because America's really not going to be seriously doing anything to get in our way. So, as I said, these are two different sort of levels of, say, trust or security relations with the United States, which is not just about with Japan, but also with, other allied countries in Asia. So Ukraine, I think it probably, sparked a lot more fear in the early stages when people were comparing Ukraine to Taiwan or having another sort of divisive confrontation sort of another sort of Cold War version 2 or whatever descending. But so, we tend to measure what Americans our sort of reliability towards the Americans in terms of what America does with or towards China.
So I remember when I was on the Hill and China was building the artificial islands, I was struck by the credulous behavior of the Obama administration. They'd say, "Oh, well, we're not really building islands for any military reason," and the question, of course, was then, well, why are you doing this? And then, of course, they put in runways, and then it was radar. I was frankly astonished at the absence of media in this country, even touching the subject. Now, whether or not that was fealty to Obama or something else, I'm curious if there's a moment that stuck out in your head where America really was getting hit in the face with clear Chinese ambitions or aggression. And for me, it was that, watching the slow roll of these artificial islands and seeing constant excuses. I mean, transparent ones, I don't like the word lies, but fabrications as to what the purpose was. And America really just didn't have time for it. Was there anything in particular you recall that should have been a wake-up call for America, or was it a slow accretion of these sorts of behaviors?
There were probably many things, as you say, slow accretion. But one thing that stands out is 2009, when Japan had the first change of power from the LDP to the Democratic Party of Japan, and we had this, and we had that sort of Senkaku Island incident, and with China, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was a bit wishy-washy, very slow in saying that this is a dispute between two countries. America doesn't interfere with these bilateral disputes. So the Democratic Party made it very, very hard for us to sort of say, "Are you serious? You're saying this to a country that we actually are, without really fear-mongering, really have security concerns about. Never mind North Korea," right? So there were a series of these incidents. But I think the problem started much, much earlier. When China was rising, everybody was speculating and said, "Oh, maybe we can embrace China to become more like us, democratic, once they turn into a market economy." When probably most of Asians were sending different signals, but the United States and the West basically ignored anything that our sort of living close to China, having a history of dealing with the Chinese, for good or bad, have had. We have insights. Well, we had insights. We had gut feelings. But I think
I remember that island
ignored.
dispute. Yeah, I remember that island dispute on the Hill. We received a lot of literature. I think I was the only staffer I knew who read it. So I recall that distinctly, and no one was paying attention to it at all on the Hill among my colleagues. But I remember going through it and thinking, this is pretty lousy. Yeah.
Christopher,
so I'm going to turn to you talking about
quick, let me have a word in. No one is paying attention to the fact that the Chinese and the Russians sailed a joint fleet around the main island of Japan on shoot. There's hardly any coverage, hardly any analysis in American media. Again, of course, it's a Democrat administration in charge. And again, there's sort of everyone just shrugs their shoulders. And this happened, of course, before the Ukraine war. This happened last year. But it is of monumental significance because the Chinese have never circumnavigated Japan, never, ever. And the Chinese and the Russians have never done a joint operation, naval operation like this. So there are lots of just as, a frog, boiling in water, the temperature is heating up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that got a few more eyeballs within policy circles than some of the other events. But you're right. There was, in terms of the television news, I think I saw nothing. A couple of articles in various newspapers, but you're right. It was met with a shrug. So, question while I've got you, Atul, how about we do one for you? So India, we'll return to India, is a key player to maintain the balance of power in Asia. It shares a long border with China, and the Indian Army is battle hardened and the second largest in the world. Many military analysts rank the Indian Navy to be the 7th most powerful in the world. What role is India going to play in Asia?
Critical. That's your one-word answer.
Right. Next question.
Well, look. Given the fact that we have a large military, given the fact that it's battle hardened, given the fact that India is a growing economy, given the fact that India is a democracy, even though if you read the New York Times, you'd think it wasn't. India will play a role, and a fundamental role, in Asia, in the balance of power. Eventually, I foresee the big powers such as India and Japan and perhaps Vietnam coming closer together, because all of them face the same threat. Xi's policy of aggressive defense, the salami tactics that, okay, take a little bit here, take a little bit there. In the case of India, it is take land, move the line of actual control, which is not defined, just a few meters here and there to strategically benefit China. When it comes to islands in Southeast Asia, fishing rights, and so on and so forth, further north towards Japan, just take a little bit more, just keep ratcheting the pressure up, and eventually something's got to give. And look, China is going through a major economic crisis. I don't know if you read the news yesterday and day before, and even today, the real estate in China is in a state of meltdown. It's the zero tolerance COVID policy of Xi has imploded in his face. Exports are down. Unemployment is going to shoot up. And look, there is a clear deal between the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and its people. It's you get the iron bowl, meaning you get rice and food security and some jobs, and frankly, the greatest achievement in human history in lifting millions out of poverty. But what you also have is this unquestioned fealty to the CCP. You cannot even have a cartoon about Winnie the Pooh. You have that, and you're off to the jail. You'll be breaking stones in Xinjiang, if not going to re-education camps. So China is no longer the China of Deng Xiaoping, which was, hide your strength, bide your time. It is now a prickly power. It is now a revisionist power. It wants an end to the slights, imagined and real, of the 19th century, and of course, the end to the 1945 post-war order. And China is led by a leader who has tightened a vice-like grip within China. Obviously, he's an impressive chap in some ways, but at the same time, it has the same risk as an extremely top-down structure has. And you could have the chances of misadventure rising, because ultimately it is one man's decision. And just as Putin took a decision, in my view, a wrong one, when it came to Ukraine, he overplayed his hand. It is extremely easy at some point for Xi to overplay his hand. In fact, I would argue that he is overplaying his hand. He's squandering the legacy of Deng. And that context, India is the only country with the manpower, with this economic heft, with the territorial size to take on China. And yet, guess what? India can take casualties. We do not have a single child policy, unlike China. Our military is composed of people from rural areas, I served as an officer in Nagaland and in Kashmir. Yeah, we can roll with the punches. We can take casualties. The Chinese can't.
Yes. You just reminded me, pursuant to what Haruko and I were discussing, the dashes. That was another thing that caught my eye. When I was working on Capitol Hill, there were more dashes every day. There's another new dash, and no one spoke about it. No one said anything about it. Now, within certain policy circles, and certainly at the Pentagon, they were paying close attention. But this ever-growing number of dashes was, they're just blowing off some steam. But switch, Philip, I want to talk to you as ask you a question rather, as a former Royal Marine Commando. Do you see Europe and the US as having the bandwidth to engage in Asia? Should China flex its muscles? Recently, Beijing signed a security pact with the Solomon Islands, fueling fears that China may seek to build a naval base in the Pacific nation. After Iraq and Afghanistan, is Ukraine the third opportunity for China to expand at US expense?
Well, as it turns out, Ukraine is much more capable of defending itself than most of us expected. And more important for Europeans and their security focus, it turns out Russia is much less able to sustain its ambitions than most people calculated before February this year. That's, I think, good news for the pivot or the tilt or what do you choose to call it, because it makes turning to Asia look less like a choice or a risk than some people would suggest. We also have, as you mentioned, the Nordics coming to join Finland and Sweden, probably joining NATO in the near future. They're highly capable military powers, not to mention committed politically as alliance members. Germany is talking about stepping up its military spending dramatically. And likewise, if it did what it's talking about to double its share of GDP on defense budget, as in Japan, there's a similar conversation, that would put Germany up there among the top military spenders. So put all those things together, you have a Europe much more capable of defending itself than maybe people have been thinking in the years before. So in a way, this is the golden opportunity for not only America, but others to rebalance and allocate a portion of their diplomatic, intelligence, security resources to the Indo-Pacific. I do not think it's odd. I think it's odd that we haven't seen more happening to demonstrate that yet. And maybe this is something we talk about, the defense posture review that we had at the end of last year was rather weak in terms of showing much of a change in the allocation of American resources from the Middle East and Europe towards Indo-Pacific. There's been a modest increase in the American commitment in Europe following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but pretty small stuff. But equally, you could say the defense posture review of last year was also quite small stuff in terms of allocating more assets to Asia. So I think that the other thing Ukraine has demonstrated is when it comes to mounting a response to aggression, collective action through institutions like the G7 is possible. Of course, as you mentioned, Atul, India has not been part of the same coalition in the sense that, say, Japan and as Haruko described, but other countries like Singapore have also joined in condemnation, in sanctions, and this is also significant, I think. China would be concerned about the risks of secondary sanctions as well. So I think in some ways, the experience of Ukraine has been an encouraging one in terms of the morale of the G7 and G7 plus, you could call it, in how they might respond to aggression, not only from Russia, but also from others like the PRC. So yeah, in that sense, I think it's far too early to say goodbye to the pivot, as the session's entitled. I think there are various points for optimism and points for pessimism about the pivot. But among them, Ukraine certainly doesn't look like it's in the pessimism category to me. It actually is the golden hour for America to really commit more materially to the pivot.
So you're arguing for a Zeitenwende, or echoing the German Chancellor.
I think that there's still some confusion about whether the German Chancellor is identifying a Zeitenwende out there that Germany has to respond to, or whether there is a genuine German Zeitenwende. It still seems a bit early to judge. It'll
Too
take
early
more
to
time.
tell it, as Zhu Enlai once said.
So they say. Yeah, but I'm actually thinking Ukraine has probably done more for the credibility of at least the logic behind the pivot than anything else in recent memory. Now we just have to see that put into action.
But, well, and you said that you were surprised in the sort of absence of U.S. allocation of resources, which makes me wonder, and I guess this will be a question for Haruko, was there really ever a true Asian pivot? Was it as fundamental as Obama's admirers suggest, or was it more smoke and fire? Did it really build anything? I mean, I recall seeing a lot of headlines about this. I don't recall seeing a lot of substance. So
you
Haruko,
basically answered. You answered, but I think this is it was misleading, because in some ways I've heard two versions of the pivot or rebalancing, saying that, well, this is just, we're recommitting or whatever, and the others would say, well, no, America's never really left Asia at all. So, and I tend to sort of see it in that sense that, yeah, I mean, America's been, to a certain extent, always committed to Asia. But there's been ups and downs in terms of their closest allies saying, is America doing enough? Or is America reassuring us? And this was particularly the case when China and Korea were rising at the same time. And I do remember, there were times when there was this Japan passing time that, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton mentioned the Republic of Korea before she said Japan or something like that. I mean, these little things, which only reflects really about Japan's own sense of insecurity. But I think it's really about the Obama administration was just confusing. It was saying all these things, and I don't know, but as you say, Christopher, there was very little to see. And the best that Japan or the allies can always do is to demonstrate that Japan is worth defending, or Japan is worth, America to extend the nuclear umbrella. That's like Japan's primary, political foreign policy goal, if you will, so that we don't really have to seriously sort of start thinking about, oh, should we go independent, or should we have nuclear weapons, all of those things. But the pivot was really, like, as I said previously, right, that during the pivot, it's when America really sort of just watched on the sidelines while China was just deciding to say, okay, I can throw this power weight all around, and nobody's going to do anything. I mean, if you remember the Hague ruling over between the Philippines and China, and of course I know that the United States is not part of UNCLOS. And America takes its own sort of selective view of how they are going to utilize or adopt international norms and laws. But I think, even that affected Philippine politics. Like it really, I could sort of say that probably, because America was a kind of nonchalant about it, that it led to Duterte coming to power deciding to sort of throw Philippines in the arms of China. Of course, then he backtracked, but so, you know, I would say that there are certain things that are about physical commitments or resource allocations, as you say, but there's also about, you know, serious diplomacy that I think is missing or has been missing in American Asia policy.
Things missing, you mean substance behind the words? Is that correct?
Substance or even wording. And also America tends to see Asian relations with Asian countries in bilateral terms. They don't see it as a whole balance. You know, Obama inviting all of a sudden out of the blue, you know, let's have the Southeast Asians come over to the United States and have a meeting. It's like out of the, okay, yeah, well, that's nice. But then do the Americans ever think about, well, maybe we should talk to the Koreans and the Japanese and say the Singaporeans together or the ASEAN leaders? When it comes to Asia, it's oddly very bilateral. And perhaps this weekend was the first time that it was sort of started off bilateral, but we had a sort of, you know, the Quad setting. But in the past 20, well, actually for the past 30 years, I think, and particularly when these countries in Asia started to develop both economically as well as politically, and they started to have a voice on the international stage, American view of Asia has never really been a holistic, you know, sort of a taking the whole view and working the parts as well as the totality in order, because to coordinate policies or even coordinate between, you know, the countries in Asia. So this is why you have something like AUKUS happening. Right? It's like, whoa,
Yeah.
you know. And in this case, it was France, but it's still, you know, of course, America doesn't need to consult, but diplomacy surely is also about, you know, behind closed doors, under the table, sort of, you know, informing and trust building. And I think that's what's been missing, which is part of the
we tend to do
concern.
we tend to do bilateral or an entire democracy summit where somehow we still don't get that right. It's either a cattle call or you know, close and cuddly with one or two people. So
you did not
Manu, I want to ask you a quick question. We talked about
you did not invite Singapore to that summit, and I can tell you my Singaporean friends, both diplomats and defense attaches, are still pissed about it.
Yeah, we kind of left Taiwan out of this one. So that's pretty big oversight. Manu, we talked about whether or not
prudent. That is probably prudent. Given the timing, it's probably prudent. But the point is that then did they have? But but was Taiwan aware of it, or did you consult with the Taiwanese? Like, look, you know, just stay on the sidelines for this one. These kind of finesse, I don't see in U.S. diplomacy, particularly when it comes to Asia.
Right. Well, I can tell you that in the domestic newspapers today and on the cable news, it's been much discussed. Not surprisingly, the Wall Street Journal has a lead editorial today on this. Even the NYT gave it some print. So, you know, there's a domestic issue as well, because a lot of Americans are very supportive of Taiwan. So this issue does crop up. And from Biden's perspective, it does leave him open to domestic political concerns and vulnerabilities. But Manu, I want to ask you, you know, we talked about, was there an Asian pivot? I suppose, is it over? Where do you think this all goes? What lies ahead for Asia?
Well, Okay, so the first thing is about the Asian pivot. I think, despite the fact that Obama administration wasn't able to deliver much, their thinking or their vision, at least behind a pivot to Asia, was right in that they anticipated that Asia will be, to quote Professor Danny Qua, it will be the center of gravity of the economic universe. The economic center of gravity is shifting eastwards. So if you look at the world today, depending upon which rankings, you look at the top 5 largest economies in the world, or 6, 3 are Asian. So you have China, you have Japan, and you have India sitting in there. This is not a world that used to, exist 80 years ago, in 1980s when the Cold War was there. But what you have is currently that the Atlanticists and the Eurocentrists, they think that the world is still as it were, a few decades ago. And therefore, their policy making is structured around that notion of the world. Whereas the world has moved on in terms of manufacturing prowess, in terms of defense manufacturing, to be specific, in terms of cyber abilities, in terms of 5G technologies, you can name it, and we can actually quote ab initio developers of the same in the Asian continent. So it's not even licensed technology that we're talking about. Couple that with a huge domestic market that each of the 3 countries has, and if you throw in the entire Southeast Asia and also Korea, it's a huge economic bloc that you're looking at. Granted, it's not politically engaged like an EU today, but what you're looking at is that this bloc is going to rise and will jostle for power. Now, the frustration in Asia vis-a-vis, let us say, the West is, as to what side are the West on, the Western countries on? Do they favor democracy? Do they put a premium on autocracies? Do they like to get business done, or do they place more emphasis on values? What do they actually stand for? And more often than not, the answer is quote unquote realpolitik. I mean, I remember in the spring of 2018, I was presenting on Quad in Tokyo University. And over there was a very senior retired civil servant from Abe administration. And it kind of was, sacrilege to talk about the Quad, and perhaps it could have defense capabilities, or, we could actually conceive of an Asian NATO. Back then it was inconceivable, but today at least, you have some conversations behind the corridors. You have a pushback against AUKUS. And why against the AUKUS? Because, I put it like, there is a candy brand called M&Ms, and you have M&Ms of the geopolitics. It's Mr. Modi and Macron, and both of them, are seeking their own perch in the firmament. And I believe, and this is my view, that both of them are currently gauging, as to what's going on in the Ukrainian theater, because no matter how we look at it, the Asian economic heft currently is being indirectly funneled behind Russia in this war. So despite all the sanctions and everything, if Russia is not on its knees, it's because it has an indirect access to, pretty much everything that it wants through China. And in some ways, I'll put in India also. So to dismiss off Asia as to say, okay, it's a, cyclical or a seasonal thing, that's not the case. The center of gravity has shifted, and so will the geopolitical center of gravity. So far we are just seeing the economic center of gravity, but the geopolitical center of gravity is also undergoing a shift, and all the countries in Asia are looking at the West as to what do they stand for, and maybe pick sides. And if there are confusing signals from there on, most people will, take up an ambiguous stance, as India is doing. It's playing all sides. It is part of all minilaterals. It's part of SCO. It is part of BRICS. It is part of Quad. You name it. It's part of everywhere. But the ultimate question is, what does India stand for? And the answer would be the same thing as the West. And then you ask, what does the West stand for? And the circular logic just goes on. So there needs to be some definition now. It has to become a serious business. Enough time for the circular logic.
I want to address on the Q&A here, our good friend Peter Isaacson asks, is the U.S. committed to any ally or region? He mentions the U.S. Created the situation in Ukraine that is now defending. Without the 2014 coup, would it have considered defending Ukraine? I can leave it to the panel. I'd be happy to jump in, but he has some choice words saying that American media are simply not interested in anything that is of monumental significance, which is a separate problem. Does the panel want to respond to that, or?
Jump in very quickly. When you have two oceans between yourself and the rest of the world, two oceans, Pacific and Atlantic, you have a huge domestic market. You have natural gas, you have oil, you have energy, you've got plenty of water, even though Arizona may not have enough or California may not have enough. But on the whole, as a country, you have enough water. You have top universities, top technology, and the elites from around the world are sending their children over. It is very easy to fall into the historic trap of manifest destiny in American exceptionalism. So America, by its nature, as many big countries are, as is China, as is India, is naturally insular. And America's foreign policy is buffeted by domestic political opinion. And in Asian terms, because we are discussing Asia, let's talk about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. A lot of energy went into negotiating the deal. It had a lot of moving parts. Yes, there were opponents. Yes, it was an imperfect deal, but it was an American play to contain China. China was not in it. Actually, India was not in it either. And then one fine day, Trump comes to power and says the TPP is off. Done, dusted. No consistency. Imagine if you're Vietnam. Imagine if you're Japan. What credibility does America have left? Of course, it has been followed by China's RCEP. Today, of course, Biden talks about, goes to Asia, goes to Tokyo and talks about, the Indo-Pacific economic framework. And the Wall Street Journal has said, it's not a real trade deal. It's talk. It's mere chat. It means nothing. America is not what it was in 1945. In 1945, America was a creditor nation. It could put money into South Korea, Japan. It could fund the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. It could rebuild the entire global economy on its own strength. Today, America is a debtor nation. Today, it is South Koreans, and Chinese, and Japanese, and Saudi Arabia buying Americans of Mohammed bin Salman now no longer take calls from Joe Biden. So it's a very different world. And the point is, America is unable to factor that in because life is generally good in America. You have Amazon, you have Walmart, you have Trader Joe's, and you have Whole Foods. So on the whole, as long as, regardless of which end of the economic cycle, economic strata you are, you can get your sparkling water or cheap sausage, and even if you're a yuppie, you can have your Lululemon and chant your Buddha, but you can ignore the world, and that is the big challenge with America: the lack of consistency, the lack of ability to look beyond their noses. And of course, the other problem, which you are very familiar with, the extreme polarization, wherein foreign policy, wherein politics doesn't stop at the shore, and even foreign policy is a football to be played in domestic politics.
Sure. And to Peter's question, in America, everything is very far away. just geographically. Perhaps it's why we're so consumed with our domestic politics. But in talking about taking an interest in the world, or I suppose pursuant to what Manu was saying about manufacturing cyber 5G technology in general, Atul, while I've got you here, what's the role of the Quad in Asia? Are we just talking shop, or is it a proto-alliance, or is it something else?
Time will tell. To quote Philip, and who was quoting Zhou Enlai. So far, everyone's testing the waters. So the Quad is really a reaction to the rise of China. We don't know what it'll be. It could be a proto-alliance. It could be a lead up to some sort of loose NATO. It could be an economic arrangement over time. After all, India does need investment and technology, and Japan and the US have that, and Australia has natural resources. So it could be anything. It could be what the parties make it out to be. People are just dating, but they are not really getting involved yet.
Mm-hmm. So, Philip, bring you in, one of these innumerable alliances and groups. France can't be ignored. It's the biggest Indo-Pacific European power. What role do you see it playing in Asia?
Well, you're asking an Englishman, so that's the first caveat I have to mention. Ask a Brit about France, and you have to take it with a pinch of salt. Yes, the biggest by land area, definitely exclusive economic zone of France, is gigantic. The UK has set itself the ambition in the integrated review published last year to be, by 2030, deeply engaged in the Indo-Pacific as the European power, I'm quoting here, with the broadest, most integrated presence in support of mutually beneficial trade, shared security, and values. There's that values again, Manu. We'll come back to that.
Philip, does that mean another Anglo-French war and you take over French territories?
I think there's a compatibility with the French and the UK ambitions, which means that we can probably avoid another 100 years of global competition at this stage.
Do it over your channel, okay? Don't bring it here.
I mean, I think that the UK would also claim to be able to chalk up some progress in this comparison in the last year or so. Of course, the AUKUS would be one of them, but so would be the proven ability to deploy a carrier strike group with allies to the region, followed by a littoral strike group, which is persistently deployed in the region, to be followed by a frigate to be forward deployed, and an increased tempo of exercises with arrangements like the Five Powers. In some ways, the UK goes with the US, which I think is the big difference really with France. France has pursued this idea of being and leading Europe in being an alternative to the United States as a framework provider of security in the region. And as I say, I think that they've had some setbacks in that, which really put that in question, if that's possible. And part of that is to do with whether the United States is welcoming another framework provider alternative, whether the countries in the region like Australia accept France in that role, and of course then whether France can lead other Europeans. When the British sailed to the Indo-Pacific, they came with a ship from the Netherlands and United States Marines and aircraft and a warship. When the French come, they don't bring, at the moment, they don't bring a European flotilla. That could change, but that's I think significant when you look at it in comparison with the declared aims of leading Europe into the region. But France is, no question, a formidable naval and military power. They're one of the very few countries able to project power at range. And that makes me remember what we were just saying earlier about just because you're a big economy, and Japan knows this from the 80s and the 90s, just because you're a huge economy, it doesn't translate automatically into being a big geopolitical power. You can decide to turn it into that. And I would say that's also on my mind, Atul, when I was listening to what you were saying about India's economic destiny. The ability to project power is something that's a choice that can come with a commitment. It doesn't necessarily grow out of economic power.
True.
I think that the positioning of France with the United States is still awkward. And so depending on how you feel about the credibility of the US pivot, is the space for France to bring this alternative? I would still question that. Can France join in a group? Well, I think there's a problem of hierarchy here. If France is leading the group, it can, but does it have followers? And if it's not leading the group, can it accept subordinate status? It definitely doesn't accept that when it comes to the United States. And say all you like, or all we have now about the comparative decline of US power in the region, I would say it's still the main power in the Indo-Pacific. All right, and if you can't be comfortable as a subordinate, or if you think that's vassal status, which is what the French Minister for Europe said about Britain sailing with the US in AUKUS, then it's not going to work. So I think that's one of the reasons I'm a bit, not just because I'm British, but I think that the French role in the region is a matter of reflection at the moment, based on what's been happening. I wanted to add a couple of things though, because we were all being very, very down on the US and its credibility and the role. So I was looking at my list of pivot optimism points in that column. I think you've had a kind of multilateralism about the Indo-Pacific, which is ironic because it's not happening in the Indo-Pacific. So what I'm talking about, when you were saying, Manu, about what does the West stand for? Is it organized? Is it coming together on a concept of what it stands for? Look at what has happened in the Biden administration in the last 6 months between Europeans and the US. There's a Trade and Technology Council meeting for the second or third time. There is a transatlantic dialogue on China policy. There's a US-UK dialogue on Indo-Pacific policy. So there are a number of steps taken now to coordinate across the Atlantic on China and Indo-Pacific policies. Actually, strangely, probably in some ways more happening transatlantic than there is, as Haruka said, between the US and groups of Indo-Pacific countries. So I think in a way, if you want to measure what America's doing with the pivot, don't overlook what happens outside the Indo-Pacific as well. A very generous observer might say the Biden administration is maybe not in a way that's communicated well, but laying the groundwork for a more long-term structure. And I think it's been given some impetus by what happened with Ukraine, because of the way people have come together on that with Russia, which reflects the fact that they know they're not, America knows it's not the global hegemon going forward, for the reasons that we've mentioned about the economic trajectories. It needs a world where allies like Japan and India and the UK do more. And they may not be going about it in the most elegant way, but I think it's starting to happen. And I think what you see happening in transatlantic diplomatic action is something that reflects that as well.
Well, Philip, you could have been forgiven if responding to the question I asked you with a Rule Britannia or something from Gilbert and Sullivan, but that was more.
Take requests.
Talking about the U.S. as a global hegemon, perhaps not having the resources to be one, or certainly retreating in certain respects from the global stage. Manu, I want to ask you a somewhat loaded question, but the U.S. left a mess at India's door with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. What are the implications for Asia?
Well, the closest border, of Afghanistan to the Indian mainland, if we go by the aerial route, is 250 kilometers or thereabouts. We don't share a land border, but there is a history of, subconventional warfare taking place using, the manpower from the Afghan militias. Now, the question here is that what has the US done? Well, the US could have withdrawn in a more elegant manner. It could have chosen to take on more stakeholders, particularly democratic stakeholders, or those folks, who had a say, on the liberal side of the things. But instead, what we have is a cut and slash kind of a maneuver in which the US left as if, it was being chased by a wild beast, and they just had to get out before a date. So you had people falling off from planes. You had embassy, staffers disappearing without telling their local Afghan employees that we're going. You had, there were just endless, incidents that were being talked about, and all of this circulated in the social media at the very grassroots in India. So, people were actually saying, oh, yes, we have the US funding a lot of gender initiatives, a lot of initiatives about, basically helping the marginalized. But look what they're doing. They're abandoning the most marginalized people on the earth. These people will have food insecurity, physical insecurity, all sorts of calamities that you could think of would befall, the civilian population there. And yet we would have the media from the US, talk about all the high liberal values and rule-based order and whatnot, while condoning all sorts of atrocities that would befall, the populace in Afghanistan. And by the way, this is not think tankers or folks who are interested talking about it. These are grandmas and housewives at the very grassroots of Indian democracy, holding a Reliance, cheap Reliance internet phone with WhatsApp, and they could get every information, perhaps, or misinformation, you could say at times. But it had an impact. And the prestige of US has taken a fall because of how it withdrew from Afghanistan. And the second thing is that it actually took apart a lot of established post-Soviet norms of how nations should conduct themselves, both in war and in peace. It just belied a lot of things. Now, it's easier for the, let us say, voting population or the electorate in the West to ignore it because, it's happening far away, just as Indians can choose to ignore what's happening in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that it's not real. The sufferings are not real. The actual, what you can call, the promise that people made to themselves after the Second World War, that we should not let this fate befall again. It's being replicated, although at a smaller level, but across countries after countries, and this is sad. So it's basically, you have this human catastrophe, which you can't do much to help about. And the folks who are powerful enough to do anything about it, they've chosen to run. Imagine Taliban is not the most friendly regime towards India, but still India is shipping wheat shipments to avoid starvation in Afghanistan that is ruled by Taliban.
And there we touch upon within our question area, Yi Wang asks, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the NATO denied direct intervention. How can the US convince China and other Asian states that it will defend Taiwan when, I would add, if Taiwan is invaded? And I think we touch on perceptions of unreliability by the US. And certainly within the context of this administration, Biden is perceived as not wanting to enter any more wars. So, when he says Putin must go, or he says we will defend Taiwan, perhaps it rings a bit hollow. Yi Wang goes on to say, how much deterrent power is Biden's promise to defend Taiwan? And I don't know if anyone else has any comments on that.
I think, can I
go ahead, Haruko. Go ahead.
Just going back to the very, also sort of following up on Philip's point about the United States, and also about how unreliable, the first question about unreliable, is that, first of all, I don't think America is inherently unreliable, just as any other country is unreliable. This is a mistake to think, going back to an old saying, right? There are no permanent friends, just interests. So the point is the point about, say, for example, even this alliance is to align the interest as much as possible. So I think, and when I stress about sort of diplomacy, this is where sometimes America is very awkward at trying to align interests. It imposes interests, but it doesn't want to align. But but I think it's also about the perception of the allies too, how much it is actually sort of, taking responsibility about their own actions and thinking about these things. So I think that to say how to measure the unreliability of the United States is perhaps unfair and probably very unrealistic. America will do whatever it feels in its national interest, and which in most cases happen to be defending certain territories or going into war and so on and so forth. So I think that's the kind of view that we all have to have about these alliances, security alliances. And going back, so that extending to Taiwan and Ukraine are a bit different, right? We all know this because there's a treaty obligation, at least between the United States and Taiwan, there is an agreement. But the whole point is that they've put themselves in both parties have put themselves in a kind of a sort of a binding situation where they really don't want a war to happen or anything to happen by force. So everybody in the past 50 years have been biding time and so on and so forth. And, when Biden says like 1937, I'm like, for goodness sake, right? Taiwan or the Republic of China was the first, charter member of the Security Council of the United Nations. And we also kind of conveniently forget this and then say, Taiwan is, how do we deal with Taiwan? So I think this is really not about, just sort of looking at what if China tries to take Taiwan by force. There's a lot more involved in terms of not just the United States, but also, say, Japan. I know that there's been some about how Japan is going to sort of place Taiwan in its sort of, commitment to the alliance. The Taiwanese tend to think, apparently, quite a high percentage of Taiwanese think that the Japanese are the reliable ones to come to their defense, which is quite surprising. And I think they are probably mistaken. But Japan leaves a deliberate ambiguity about what the tasks that will involved in this sort of with the alliance. This is precisely because, we also need to have good relations with China and so on and so forth. So this is very different from Ukraine. And it really would take, if China really does something as silly as shooting rockets and so on, I would like to think that China's, this would be really catastrophic, I think. And I think China knows that. But the sad thing about Taiwan is that it's always in that sort of state of suspension, right, between these sort of backdoor negotiations, politicking, and reassurances. And so I think this is a very difficult, and I don't think it's not, so Biden saying that, we'll go and defend, I am not so sure it's useful vis-a-vis how the Chinese might take that signal from the United States saying, are you backtracking on the agreement or the position? So that's why I say that diplomacy is seriously quite important.
Christopher, could I come in on
Please
on what Haruka was saying as well?
Sure, go ahead.
I would respectfully disagree with the questioner in that I think the US and Biden is basically doing what they said they would on Ukraine. Ukraine is not a NATO member. The United States policy was never to say we will go and fight in Ukraine and defend Ukraine from invasion. That was never a commitment. They did say basically what you just said, Haruko, about Taiwan. They said, if you did it, it would be a catastrophe, and we will impose a cost on you for doing it. But of course, as we see, that was insufficient as deterrence. Just to describe cost imposition and to say we will help them, although we don't know the outcome in Ukraine yet, maybe it will go the way of defending Ukraine and Ukraine restoring its sovereignty. So we'll see. But I think that was the thinking that was also behind what President Biden was just saying in Tokyo now, which is because of the way that deterrence approach failed in Ukraine, we have to do even more when it comes to Taiwan than what we were willing to do in the way we signaled and we made diplomatic messages in the lead up to the February invasion of Ukraine. But I think the test of that is going to be, do you see the capacities moving into place to do what Elbridge Colby talks about, the deterrence by denial rather than the deterrence by cost imposition? And that will probably be the litmus test of how seriously people take what President Biden's just said about America's commitment with Taiwan. Although again, it to be fair, it probably pays to look carefully at the language and not project onto America things that America hasn't promised. So just like they didn't promise to fight Russia for Ukraine, President Biden hasn't promised to fight China over Taiwan. He said they would become involved militarily. Well, there are lots of interpretations within that language. So yeah, I think we have to be careful in reading too much into what American leaders say and giving them the benefit of taking it more literally rather than, building it up to be more than it is.
Well, I think we have to be careful in reading too much into what Joe Biden says. There were several other misstatements of U.S. policy.
He's getting old, Christopher. Give the man a break. He's getting old. He grows old. He grows
and that's
old.
when he comes on.
He'll wear the bottoms of his trousers rolled.
Sure. That's the problem. I mean, I would hope, were I staffing him, or I would think he would be more cautious with the words he uses, given that on 2 or arguably 3 other occasions, his remarks have been interpreted as being unequivocal in military support for Taiwan. I would think he would have been clearer and more cautious in his wording. The New York Times yesterday reported that staffers at the event were caught off guard. And it was interesting with what haste and dispatch, not to mention murky wording in its own right. This release came out and said, as the president said, there has been no change in policy. And of course, the people reporting then on the White House statement scratched their head and said, well, wait, that's not what we heard. What do you mean, as the president said? So it was interesting that there seemed to be, at the very least, an incaution for a third time, and that there certainly also has not been the usual kind of coordination or consensus building. There have been no meetings, nothing like that, where it would seem that they're developing a policy and trying to sell it. So that's my final word on that. Well, y'all have been great, or as they say in Texas, if it's more than 2 people, all y'all. And I think this has been wonderful. We've gone a touch over, but it was so interesting, I thought we'd just let it run. And I want to thank everyone.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you next time.
Yep.
See you anon. Bye.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.